Now for today's program. Rebecca Clarren has written about the American West for more than 20 years, and her work has appeared in such publications as Mother Jones, High Country News, The Nation, and Indian Country Today. Rebecca has won the Hillman Prize, an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, and 10 grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Rebecca is the winner of the 2021 Whiting Nonfiction Grant for her just-released book, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance. Joining Rebecca today is Moment Editor Sarah Breger. Sarah is also the director of Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Please welcome Rebecca Clarren and Sarah Breger.
Thank you, Suzanne, for organizing this, and thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today.
Thank you.
As I was reading your book, I kept hearing in my head the refrain, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If you had written a story about, your family, triumphs and setbacks in South Dakota, Dayenu. If you'd written a book about, the Lakota Nation and, the U.S. government's, attempt to dispossess them, Dayenu. If you had written a book about Teshuvah, and making amends, Dayenu. But somehow kind of weaving these three strands together, it created something that felt really significant as you were reading it.
Well, that means so much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today. These are really hard, heavy moments. And I just want to acknowledge that, and that many of you may be here and be feeling the heaviness and the heartache that I feel too. And I'm so glad you're here. I think in these moments, it's really nice to be connected and to gather. And I also feel like in light of the suffering that is happening throughout the world, and especially in the Middle East right now, it feels more vital than ever to me to explore these histories of oppression. And such as this very specific, awkwardly, my book is posing here behind me, but this very specific and unique story that I'm trying to tell here in my book, which is about healing and repair, and about how I've taken a very large collective history here in America and told it, through my own personal history. So thanks for everyone being here, and thank you, Sarah, for having this conversation.
Could you maybe we could start a little by you could tell us how your family, came from Russia and ended up in South Dakota.
Yeah. So it was important to me to tell a story that I think my whole career I've been trying to take the policies that government puts out and show how they ripple in the lives of real people. And so this book doesn't start in America because of precisely that reason, because the reason you get a Jewish family of immigrants living on the South Dakota prairie in the early 1900s is because of what was happening in Russia in the early 1900s. My family, like so many of your families probably, I would imagine, who are on this webinar, experienced incredible oppression in Russia. My great-great-grandfather, Harry Sinekin, was about 19 years old, and he was living in Odessa, and he was beaten to within an inch of his life in the 1881 pogrom. And the house that he was living in with his father, maybe his uncle, the stories go back and forth, was set fire. Throughout the rest of his life, he suffered from smoke inhalation. He seemed, I think, probably to have a traumatic brain injury. His behavior was described by his children in letters that I read as erratic. And he came back to Kapulia, which is a tiny town near Minsk in what is today Belarus, to recover. That's where his mother was living. But life continued to be very hard for Jews, as we know, in the Pale. They weren't allowed to own land. There was so much threat of violence that they were living with all the time. And he and his family come to America. And his younger brother, when he comes, he does what so many immigrants do. He goes where he knows people. And there was a whole large group of Jews from Slutsk, I think I'm saying that right, who end up in Sioux City, which is the end of the railroad line at the time. And the people who had come before would get jobs for the people who were newly arrived in as peddlers and meat packers. And my ancestors all assemble in Sioux City. And we don't know the exact specifics, but it's likely Harry heard about the free land on offer in the Dakotas, probably around about 1905. And he, like many, many other people, most of them not Jewish, but he and about 30 other Jewish families, and my family included, they all go and they settle on the South Dakota prairie in an area. If you know South Dakota, if you've ever been to Wall Drug, it was about 25 miles northeast of Wall. And they had this little shtetl on the prairie. That's how they
And it ended up being called Jew Flats.
Yes, when I was doing my research for this book, locals still refer to this place as Jew Flats, even though my family sold the last of our land there in 1970. And really, there's been no Jews that I know of that have lived there since, but they still, in fact, one local said to me, "Oh, I never knew why we called it Jew Flats. I never thought of it until meeting you." Yeah.
They
had a Torah, they had a mikvah. There's this like fantastic handed down story about my great grandmother who would send her daughters in the winter, which was so cold in South Dakota, out to the creek behind her house so it could crack the ice so she could dunk herself in her mikvah, which, as many of you know, is the ritual bath that Jewish women take to end their menstrual cycle. So it's amazing.
You mentioned free land policy. Could you talk a little bit about that and even what homesteading is?
Sure. So it's a big question. So the United States was very interested in connecting the state of California with all of its natural resources to the rest of the country, especially the East Coast. And they learned fairly quickly railroads were the largest corporations of their time. And like today, those corporations had a huge influence on politics and the way laws were written. And so there was a lot of corporate pressure to create this railroad line, and government policy rushed in to help make that happen. What they learned very quickly is that the way to support long haul traffic was with short, little traffic along the railroad line. So small towns sprung up along this railroad line to help, and people, they needed to bring people to the prairie. Well, starting in 1851, the United States had signed treaties with the Lakota Nation and other Plains Native nations, reserving land there for the Native peoples. And so promises made become promises broken. And between 1850, by 1868, they're breaking that treaty and rewriting that treaty. In 1877, they change it again. And in 1889, they change it again. And every time the United States breaks their promises and rewrites what they're going to do, with most of the time with very little input, acknowledgement or input of what Native people want, despite incredible diplomacy on the part of these Native leaders. The land is diminished and dispossessed. And I have a map in my book that shows how within a relatively short period of time, the Lakota Nation is living on, between 1881 and like the early 1900s, they lose 98% of the land that was reserved for them in 1851. And part of what happens in that is like a very intentional United States policy to eradicate the buffalo, because it's tricky to have a railroad line going through if you've got these huge wild buffalo populations and you have Native people who their economy is based on following the buffalo and hunting the buffalo. And so they eradicate the buffalo. There's a photo in my book of like these buffalo skulls that are stacked 2 or 3 stories high. And within a very short period of time, by the time my family's on the prairie, there's like 500 buffalo left from millions and millions of buffalo that had lived there before. And Native people are put on reservations where they're not allowed to leave the confines of the reservations without a permit and permission from the white Indian agent who was an appointed person by the federal government. So I hope that answers your question. The Homestead Act was a much larger policy, and the Homestead Act said, we will give you free land. And most overwhelmingly, the people that got in on this free land were white or white enough. There were a few thousand people who were people of color, but the vast majority were not. And these kinds of land policies that provided free land for white settlers have been referred to by legal scholars in more recent years as a huge form of affirmative action for white people. And so my family, like these other homesteaders, were given 160 acres that was theirs to keep if they could what was called prove up, which meant that sometimes it was 3 years, sometimes it was 5 years, depending on the time. They had that much time to show that they were cultivating the land, that they had built a structure on the land, and that they were living there at least half of the year full time.
You mentioned the buffalo. I think I was really surprised when I was reading about the sort of viciousness of the U.S. government in terms of, right, like purposefully, killing the buffalo, outlawing, spiritual practices that the Lakota had, creating these treaties that you mentioned, and then reneging on them, over and over again. Is what happened to the Lakota Nation a microcosm of what was happening across the United States at the time?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it was. Yeah. And of course, the specifics, there are more than 570 federally recognized Native nations in our country. So it's important. I feel like it's really important to note that every one of those nations has their own very unique history and their own unique treaties that they signed. But there is research that has been done by Native scholars, and that I'm thinking of one in particular at Rutgers, who said, no treaty was signed without some form of duress, some form of like forced poverty. And killing the buffalo was a totally intentional piece of like, if we take away the means for people to support themselves and they're starving, which they entirely become starving, they will have to negotiate with us. They'll have to sign treaties. And that did play out in every case, but it was, the specifics are different, and I can't speak to every single nation's specific history.
Did your family have contact with the Native American population when they were there?
So I love that question, because I grew up hearing like a handful of stories about my family's time on the land. In the book, I call them our greatest hits. And there's that story of the mikvah, and there's the story of my uncle, or my cousin actually, who, when he was 5 years old, every morning he would clear a path of rattlesnakes to get to the outhouse. And, there were these mysterious photos that didn't have stories attached with them of my ancestors posing with Native people. And but we didn't have a story about them. We were proud of those pictures. They weren't anything that we were, ashamed of or anything. They were seen as very interesting, but no one had a story. And part of my research in my book was to try and answer the mysteries of these photographs, and also to fill out. I was very driven in this book to say, what are the stories we tell in families and in nations, and what are the stories we don't tell, and why don't we tell those stories? Because of course they both equally are creating the myth that we want of our families and of our nations. And so I was trying to sort of fill in the white spaces around those stories. The photographs have been very hard to like solve those mysteries. And what I've learned is, despite, like, there's one of my uncle Jack, who's my great uncle, shaking hands with a Lakota man in full regalia. And through that photograph, I have come to know the descendants of that man. And that person was Joseph Whitebull, who was Sitting Bull's nephew and a really famous person. There was a whole book written about him in the 30s. But I've also learned that they mostly had no interaction with their Native neighbors. They were only 13 miles from the southwest corner of the Cheyenne River Reservation. And that was just on the other side of the Cheyenne River, which at the time was undammed and easily forded. And people would go back and forth between the reservation and the communities where my family was living. But they mostly did not have much interaction. And that was very intentional. Like, federal policy was, we don't want these people interacting, and we don't want them to know each other. That's why there were those passes for people to leave. The schools were kept separate. And And I think there was also so much racist messaging that my family received when they come to this country that taught them to be terrified of the Lakota. And so as I started to scratch the surface and I interviewed everyone in my family of my mom's generation and older to hear like what are their handed down stories that they received. And what I heard was just that they were afraid, and that fear was both by federal policy and by sort of systemic social issues that kept them separated. Even though the fear, there was really nothing to be afraid of at that point. There had been no violence between Native people towards white settlers for at least a generation by the time my family gets there. But, that those myths continued.
Was there also an element of kind of trying to fit in with, their white neighbors at the time and be, not wanting to be the other, so creating another other in a way?
Absolutely. My family, they, like so many of our families, they escape oppression. They come to America. They're in the land of the free. My great grandfather apparently really believed that there was like the streets here were paved with gold, and they come, and yet they're still in exile. They're still the other. And there's incredible anti-Semitism in Sioux City where they're living, and they are struggling like all immigrants to shake off their accents. They all worked really hard to be able to speak English, to not sound like they had accents, and to become educated. And some research has shown that actually for immigrants, that even those who failed to prove up, the experience of homesteading, of being farmers and ranchers, was actually really important for them. It helped them shake off their suspect immigrant status and become more American. And so there's sort of this there was a social class elevator built in to having land. Even if the land didn't end up building your wealth in the way that it did, it really helped my family to do so. So it's interesting. I think it was very important. My great grandmother and her sister used to call the ranch the good earth. And my Aunt Etta, who's 90 years old, talks about her mom and her aunt as saying that they loved it. They felt so free. The fact that they could own land when they couldn't in Russia, for generations of our family couldn't own land there. It really was so important to them.
You had mentioned that, this book was kind of telling the stories we tell ourselves and then the stories we don't tell ourselves. Was there anything surprising that you learned as you were going about researching this book about your family?
Oh my God. So many surprising things. I could just talk to you all day about the surprising things. So I'll probably try and limit it here because I know you have more questions. But one of the really surprising things that I learned is that it wasn't just homesteaders that got free land, individuals, but churches actually also got free land. That under President Grant, he wanted to put moral people in charge of Native Americans, and they were reservations or even pre-reservations, the agencies they were called. And Christians were deemed the right people for the job because they would convert these Native people and make them help break the Native relationship with land. So much Native spirituality, especially for the Lakota, but I think it's pretty universal, is built into the land and the place that they feel that they live with. And so I looked it up in the congressional record. There's a line that Jews are not allowed to have the job because they're not in the business of converting. There were still a few Jews put in charge of some of these places, but the federal government divvies up the different Native nations. The Methodists get one group, the Episcopalians get another. And when these organizations come in, they're not just given souls to convert, they're also given free land. And I was so surprised to learn that today there are still many churches in America that own land on Native reservations. Some of them are doing an incredible job of working to actually give that land back to those nations. And some of them aren't. And they're actually making money off that land that they don't share with the Native nation where they're living at all. And so that was one really surprising thing. Another was thinking about how I had always understood prohibition to be about, about helping women whose husbands are drinking down their pensions. And that was a little bit about it. There were some activists who were pushing for prohibition because of that, but far more of the efforts to make prohibition and come into play was anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Jewish, anti-Italian, anti-Irish, because I learned that Jews back in the old country, my great grandfather in particular, were often put in charge. The Poritzers, the Russian noblemen, would put Jews in charge of their saloons or their taverns and inns. Jews, with our culture of drinking wine on Shabbat, were seen as being able to handle their liquor. And so when Jews come to America, this is a business they know. And that was particularly true in my family. They used some of the money they got off of their land to start saloons in Lead, in the Black Hills. And so when prohibition comes in and they lose the idea was, we'll take these jobs away and then those immigrants will go back where they came from. But of course, no one was going to go home. That wasn't a safe idea. And so that's why when there was bootlegging, there was a lot of Jews who got involved with bootlegging. That was really interesting to me. I learned, I think the thing that was also really new and also really hard is the stories we have about my family. They have a kind of classic script of, look how hardworking they were, look how religious they were, look how they all stayed together as a family. They are teaching tools, those stories. And we don't throw anything away in my family. I am the same way. I have boxes in my attic of like things that I have had since elementary school. And because of that, I had like 30-day diaries that had been kept of my great grandmothers. I had literally thousands of pages of letters and receipts and tax returns. And I guess the other thing that was surprising was, and just challenging, was like to see them as more real people, to see the ways that these ancestors who always posed for photos in like flattering clothing, they were imperfect. They made terrible mistakes. They were human. And I think that's both the gift of my research and the heartache of it too.
How did your family respond to you kind of revealing, I don't know even know if they're secrets, but in some ways revealing kind of the truths maybe behind some of your relatives?
It's been a journey. I would say that for the most part, my family's been amazing. And there are especially people of my generation have said things to me like, we're so proud that you and honored that our family story gets to be a part of telling this broader family story. And this is so important. And I've also felt like, even for the family members that this is hard for them, that they feel embarrassed. And there are some that do feel not embarrassed. It's interesting. It's not the things that I think there's anything to be embarrassed about, but things that have to do in my family, I think are common, things like domestic violence and involvement with bootlegging. And to me, they're just signs of the system we were dealt. And, we have to take responsibility for that, but also we can share that responsibility for the way America was and how we were being inserted into this place. But even those people who are embarrassed, it's been incredible to see they can hold two things at once. They can hold, this is really hard. And they're also saying to me, and I love you, and I'm so proud of you. And thank you for doing this. And that gives me a sense of hope, actually, the two things that people can feel all of it at once.
I thought it was funny that I think Etta kind of, there are some things that scandalized her, like bootlegging, that maybe we wouldn't find so scandalous in a way.
I know. And you think about like, how I feel a lot of heartache for her, because it was very embarrassing for her family, her generation, but like the rest of us find it very interesting, actually, and something even to be a little bit proud of, that we have these relatives who saw a bad law and stuck it to the man in a way. And it's so yeah, I think generations change, right?
And another part of your book is, or as you were writing the book, you were also studying concepts of teshuvah or repentance. What did you learn as you were doing that?
Well, just to back up before I answer that question, before this book was even a book, and I had been hired to write a series of stories that ran in the Nation and Indian Country Today. And as part of one of those about Native nations and Native citizens. And one of them was a profile of Judge Abby Abenanti, who is the Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation in Northern California. And her courtroom, she's using her courtroom there. She's imbuing her jurisprudence with traditional Yurok values and tradition and culture. And she's become a model for judges nationwide for how to, I think, have a more empathetic approach to justice. So I was working on this. It was just an idea formulating at the time. And I talked to her about this book idea. And she said, well, if you're going to retell those entangled histories and you're going to think about it, you should study the Jews. You need to look at your own culture. What do the Jews say about how to repair, how to respond to a harm, even one you didn't directly cause, but one you've benefited from? And that guidance set me on a path of studying with my rabbi, Benjamin Barnett, who's here in Portland. And I have a synagogue that's very committed to social justice. And he was immediately like, this is important learning for our whole community. So we did a process of Hevruta, studying in pairs, and we read ancient texts in the Talmud and the Torah that talk about atonement and repair and repentance. And then we also studied what contemporary rabbis in America are writing about those topics. And, we studied far more than I put in the book, but that process of teshuvah, as you say, like of returning to our inherent goodness, as my rabbi would call it, of the grappling that is so very Jewish, it really helped me start to think about how to respond to this history. And those conversations were I then involved Lakota elders who had come to trust me to share, what would help them for me and my family. And ultimately, I do offer a kind of step toward repair that my family is taking. And it's what I refer to as our piece of the stolen beam, because of that piece of learning from the Talmud. Should I talk about it here, do you think?
Yeah, I think that would be great, because I think
okay.
I was not familiar with it.
Oh, great. Okay, so there's a conversation in the Talmud between two rabbis, and discussing, well, what happens if it's discovered that a house or even a palace was built with a stolen beam in its foundation? And one rabbi says, well, you have to knock the whole house down and then you can give the beam back. And the other rabbi, who is the far more pragmatic, said, you don't have to do that, but you have to repay the person whose the beam was stolen from for the value of the beam. But both rabbis make clear that once you know that the beam was stolen, you can't do nothing. You have to do something. And Sharon Brous, who's the rabbi at ICAR in LA, wrote in a 2017 sermon at the High Holidays, she said, our country is built on a stolen beam. And her sermon's amazing, and you can find it online. It's really beautiful. And she talks about how attending to this stolen beam diminishes our government and our nation. And so that story has really meant a lot to me as I'm thinking about how to proceed.
I think that example struck me too, because even as I was talking about this book with people, so many people surrounding me, who are Jewish, kind of said, this isn't really our issue. It's, we came much afterwards. It's not our problem in a way.
I love that you're bringing that up.
Yeah.
At one point, my rabbi and I, this was about a year and a half ago, I think, to extend the learning we were doing with ourselves to the larger part of our Jewish congregation, we offered a class, and the rabbi taught the Jewish teachings, and I shared the history I was learning. And I think, these were very smart, very well-meaning people. And I think a lot of them came to this saying, well, this is a societal issue. This is something I care about, but it has nothing to do with me because of that. Exactly. it's very uncommon. My family's history of being Jewish homesteaders is not, of course, it was like very small percentage of all homesteaders. It was a very small percentage of Jewish immigrants. And so most Jews were very poor and most Jews didn't get land. And so what does this have to do with us? But I actually feel like by the end of the class, people found themselves in this story. They found the way they personally have benefited. And there's another story from Deuteronomy, which is this. In Deuteronomy, it's described the pre-Israelites debating, like, what happens when there's a murdered person found in the middle of the road and you can't determine who did the murdering. They don't just walk away from this body. There's this sense that if you leave the sin unattended of the murder, it will pollute the entire area. And so they measure their distance. The communities that are closest, they measure their distance, and whoever is closest attends to the body, and they do a ritual that at the time involved like a bloody heifer and a river, but had an economic cost to those people. And Rabbi Tova Spitzer, she's another wonderful rabbi from the East Coast. She has a great sermon, and she says, sin is social and repair is collective. And I really feel my favorite feedback of people who've read this book have been to say, I read this book, and it's about your family, but it made me think about my own. And I do feel like everyone who is living in America today has benefited from the taking and theft of native land. Margaret Jacobs, who's an incredible historian, talks about this very eloquently in her book, After 100 Winters, that, if you're living in America today, stolen land is the foundation of our highway systems. It's the foundation of our cities. There are so many different examples, which I lay out in my book. And what's my distance, because my family were homesteaders, maybe my distance to taking responsibility for that is closer than someone who arrived here last week or whose family ancestors came on a slave ship. But we all actually benefit. And I think we all can start to consider our distance. I hope we can.
And for you personally, have you thought about ways of, I don't know if making amends is the right word, but I know you've talked about the different steps of teshuva or repentance. Is there anything personally you've taken on in a way?
Yes. So as what you're referencing, Maimonides lays out this very scripted 16th century Sephardic rabbi and philosopher. He has this very legalistic, the 6 steps toward repentance. And, the first one is you have to stop doing the harm. And I would argue that we have not stopped doing harm in America to Native nations and Native people. And the second step is to tell the truth out loud to the whole community. And I interviewed Danya Rettenberg, whose book on repentance and repair really looks at Maimonides' teachings. And I said, why do we have to do that? Why do we have to tell the truth out loud? And she said, because you've got to own your stuff, and it's accountability. And so in some ways, this book is my effort to try, I'm sure I've missed the mark in some ways, but to try and tell the truth out loud. And I have resources for further research in the back of my book. It's also on my website, which is not shouldn't be seen as like the definitive thing, but it's resources that were very helpful for me in my research and helping me find myself in this story, and I hope could be available for other people who want to start doing this work. My family's model of how we are thinking about repair is just one. I mean, I hesitate to go into details here, because I will just say it's something that was done with great thought after a lot of grappling with this specific history. But I think there are many people throughout this country who are starting to. Unfortunately, we're in a vacuum of federal leadership on this issue. And there's not really been any real apology from the United States to our Indigenous people in America. There hasn't really been any steps towards a kind of like truth and reconciliation effort like they've done in Canada. But there's research that shows local efforts at the state level, in the community level, are really meaningful. They really matter. There's a Lakota elder who I came to know in the course of my research, Fred Dubray, who's a buffalo rancher. And he said to me, it's hard to heal when no one has ever apologized. So
when you were talking to different members in the Lakota community, did you sort of bump up against any resentment or sort of even anger toward your family?
no, actually, I didn't. I mean, maybe some people were skeptical of me at first, but I guess I'm a little used to that from being a reporter, visiting communities that I'm not a part of. And it seemed normal, really. And so I think people felt a little, maybe initially, who are you and what are you doing here? But no, I think most people were just amazed that I was interested, because it's rough in South Dakota. I've met a lot of really amazing people in South Dakota, and I don't want to paint it with a really too broad of a brush, but there's so much racism there, and so much tension between people who are Native and people who are not Native. And so to have a Native person a non-Native person such as myself coming with an open heart and an open mind was not an experience that a lot of them had experienced. Yeah.
For you as a journalist, how was it kind of in becoming the story instead of, you've been reporting on the American West for 20 years, but now you are kind of the center of the story?
Yeah. Oh, so uncomfortable in some ways. And in other ways, really a relief. I felt like, all these years I've been reporting on and off about Native nations for a long time. And it felt a little bit of relief to just be transparent about my positionality here, to recognize and to be owning my distance, I guess we could call it, to this story, and not sort of write about it as if it had nothing to do with me, which is journalism. And there's a lot to be said for that. But I was so glad to be able to be clear in that way. And I do try and, there's sort of a real personal, at the prologue, I really kind of talk about myself. And then I do try and come back a bit. So it's not me kind of hand wringing throughout the book at all, but it's voicey, and, I'm in it, but not, it's not exactly my story, even though I'm there, I think. I don't know. Do you agree? What would you say?
Right. I mean, I think your family is sort of an example of how this happened. And it's not even just Jewish. It's kind of how this happened, to everyone in that area. Yes,
exactly. I do think there's like some things that are just fascinating if you're a Jewish person, that most of us have no idea there were Jewish homesteaders, Jewish ranchers. Like, it's a very interesting slice of Jewish history that doesn't mostly get told. But yeah, I mean, there's far more about immigrants as a whole, American immigrants as a whole on the prairie too, as well.
I had one question before we get to audience questions. One thing that was really surprising in the book was how you had mentioned that actually when Hitler was sort of thinking of restrictions toward Jews, he looked toward the U.S. government's restrictions toward, Native peoples. Was that something, surprising to you? And I'm curious what exactly, the restrictions that kind of translated.
I am so glad. That should have been the first thing I said when you asked about surprising things I learned. In a way that is the most surprising and upsetting. I was this kid who was obsessed with the Holocaust. I read like Anne Frank. I wore that book out. I read like every book I could get my hands on as a preteen. And yet I never knew until Doug Whitebull, this Lakota elder I came to know, said to me, he told me Hitler was inspired by America. And then I went off and did a bunch of research and learned so much that's true. There's an incredible book by James Whitman out of Yale called Hitler's American Model. And it was in all sorts of ways. The way that the United States has restricted food and put people on reservations in a state of starvation so that they could be controlled, that was very inspirational to Hitler and how he would treat Jews in concentration camps. he specifically, I don't have the language right in front of me, but he said something about, he referred to reservations basically as concentration camps. And his legal team dug deep into American law for how to legally restrict the rights of Jewish citizens based on how Native and Black Americans had their legal status restricted. And lastly, the policy of Lebensraum that Hitler enacted of like, we need living space for all of our Aryan nations, and that was used to justify the slaughter of so many Slavs, that was based on manifest destiny. So, Doug once said to me, he said, he called me the day after Holocaust Remembrance Day. And he said, I saw these people who had survived the Holocaust, and they were talking on the news, and I immediately thought of you and your family. And he said, we should condone Hitler. We should. But why doesn't America condone itself? Like my family, we had a Holocaust here and it lasted 400 years and we never talk about it.
So let's go to questions. There are a few questions, I think, more about kind of what was it like to be a Jew during that time. Someone asked,
my ancestors were there.
Yes. Someone asked if the Jews were settling, if the Jews who came, did they keep kosher, and then how were they able to get kosher food or keep a kosher home?
That's a great question. So my great-great-grandmother, Fega Etka, got really thin on the prairie because it was so hard to get kosher food, and she was determined to keep kosher. And at one point, my great-grandfather's brother, who was a rabbi trained at the Shlepska Yeshiva, apparently a very big deal in the family stories, he would kosher the meat. But he left the prairie, and suddenly there was no one to kosher meat. And most homesteaders would go to Pierre or Rapid City on the South Dakota prairie, and they would buy enough food for like 6 months, and that would be bacon and beans and flour and sugar and things like that. And of course, my family wasn't going to have bacon, so it was part of why Fega Etka's children were working to get her off the prairie. It was because she was not eating enough, because it was hard for her to get kosher food. Some of them really gave up being kosher, and it was a mix of how they responded. And that actually was very sad. The stories are for my great-great-grandmother. It was so important to her that people retain their traditions. And in some ways, we are all, as my family, we're a very Jewish family, and very, it's a real mix, but people for the most part have all had b'nai mitzvahs and attend synagogue and go to Jewish camp, things like that. But whether we keep kosher or not is not entirely been passed down. So, and that was upsetting. That was a thing that was hard, and my great-great-grandmother struggled with what will be the new traditions in this new place, and what will they lose?
When people left the flats, someone asked, where did they go next? What was kind of the next step?
Great question. So to put meat on the bones of those stories that I was handed down, I used some investigative reporting tools. And so I actually pulled the deed on every single, on my family's land. I pulled every deed, and I pulled every mortgage for those deeds. And you start to see a pattern that my family would take a mortgage out on the land on South Dakota, and then they would go start a business that wasn't dependent on weather, or they would move. And they did, so that the ranch was very important psychologically. It was very important economically. They didn't live on the land, most of them, that long. Within at least 20 years, many of them moved to Minneapolis and St. Paul. And they initially were in the Black Hills of South Dakota, but then when prohibition comes into the Dakotas before it's a national law, and most of them were working in the liquor industry and had saloons or liquor distribution companies. So when prohibition comes in 1916 to the Dakotas, that's when many members of my family move and relocate to St. Paul. And that's where they mostly stay. Some of the Jew flat settlers go back to Sioux City. Some end up in Omaha. And I have a pretty Western family. I mean, there's a lot of people in the Midwest, but I have relatives in Utah and Arizona and out in the Northwest and California. You know, we stayed out here for the most part. Yeah.
Did you find any examples of Jewish Native American intermarriage in your research?
A little, yeah. It wasn't really my focus, but I'm guessing it has happened, and I've actually heard about it more from a few Lakota people telling me about that, and I definitely think it happened, but I don't know too much. I can't really speak to it. I just heard a few stories.
And one person actually just wrote a comment that his dad is Lakota Sioux, and so in our household we had both Jewish and Sioux traditions. He now lives on the reservation.
Oh yeah, I
That's
think
interesting.
Yeah. At one point, a woman who lives on Standing Rock and runs the visitor center, she told me how she's Lakota and she has so many friends who are Jewish. And I said, why do you think? And she said, because we're all so oppressed. And I think there's also like using humor to deflect that oppression and mitigate and like deal with oppression feels very alive to me in both cultures. So there's, that's a similarity.
For both cultures or both peoples, is there kind of this inherited trauma that even plays out today?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it was very important to me to tell this history, to make it clear that history doesn't live in a box. This isn't the past, what I'm describing here, that as I say in the book, like I used to think that history was something we're walking away from. And now I feel like more like the history is threaded to this contemporary moment, like thread through a seam. And so because of that understanding that I have come to have, the book goes back and forth between the past and the contemporary moment. And I do think when you read the book, you understand the legacy of federal policies, that it's continuing to affect the current day, and that sure, there's intergenerational trauma that gets carried down. And I know for my own family, like that is different in my family, maybe, than it is in other Jewish families. And at one point, Judge Abby was saying to me, I said, I really wanted to understand, did my family know what was happening on the nearby reservations to Native people, the terrible treatment people were being had there? Did they know? And it was hard to figure out. And Judge said to me, everyone knew what was happening to Indians. And she immediately was so empathetic to my family. She said, when you're running for your life in trauma, when you're running for your very life, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation along the way, like it. And she said, it takes several generations of not living in trauma to begin to step toward repair. And she said, so that's why, and she said it in this very kind, gentle way, but she said, that's why it's come to you and in your generation, because you were fortunate. You didn't have to grow up in that trauma. And I would say that's true in my experience.
A few people have asked if your ancestors had any relationships with Black Americans in the area.
Not that I know of. I know there's a story of a cousin of mine who in St. Paul ended up, she's a distant cousin, but she married a black man. But no, that's not part of anything anyone ever talked about. And we were mostly in the Dakotas, and my sense is that's not like a huge population of Black Americans in the Dakotas that I know of. I think there were some, but that wasn't part of the history I was taught or that I found.
Yeah. A few people wrote in just to share that there's a Ken Burns documentary, The American Buffalo, that is playing, I guess, yesterday, maybe tonight on PBS, that they say touches on a lot of these same themes.
I've been keeping an eye out for that. So thank you for sharing. There's also a really amazing film called The Lakota Nation versus the United States that's out in some theaters and is streaming, and I would recommend also, which touches on similar themes. There's a wonderful poet, Layli Long Soldier, who is Oglala Lakota. She wrote an entire book called Whereas of poetry that responds to the lack of apology that like the Obama administration crafted. It was sort of this very legalistic, careful kind of apology that was tacked onto the Department of Defense appropriations bill and wasn't very well publicized. Anyway, her poetry is in that film as well.
So someone did recommend that documentary too. I was going to mention, definitely in good company. Someone was wondering what the kind of population of the Lakota Nation is now. How many are there, and where are they mostly located, if you know?
Well, I'm not the right person to ask about that. And I wish I could tell you. What I can tell you is that there was a policy called relocation that happened in the 50s and 60s, which was the United States again changed its mind. And instead of saying, we're going to assimilate Native people and we're going to use agriculture to assimilate them, and we're going to make them be a people whose economy and religion and culture is based on movement, to make them stasis, and we're going to put people on reservations and we're going to make them farmers. And instead they started to say, well, now that's not working out so well, and actually there's not that much, we've screwed up in the way we've appropriated land, and there's not really enough land left in the Dakotas for all the Native people. And so instead, I mean, I'm saying that a bit in quotes, but so the new policy was, let's get Native people to assimilate them. Instead, we'll put them in cities, and we'll give them jobs. We'll make them have blue collar jobs. These were not great jobs. These were pretty bad jobs. And so there was something called relocation, where you could get, if you were a Native person, you could get a free bus ticket to go to a handful of different cities throughout America. And so there are a lot of Native people that no longer live on the reservation, that live in Chicago and Minneapolis and Portland and Seattle and LA and San Francisco, the list goes on, because their family was relocated. And a lot of families didn't stay, but a lot of families did. And so it's a mix. You can look it up. I don't want to say something and be you can find it, of how, there's really good, if you look up relocation, you can find some really good research about that.
I think this should be the last question, and actually this is a nice one to end on. If you had to impart lessons to, someone was wondering if you wanted to impart lessons to the readers, or I would say even the people who are watching this Zoominar, what would they be? And I assume it's surrounding this book.
You don't want parenting tips from me.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I would love it if you're inspired to consider your distance from this harm that America has made to Native nations. And if you would go and look at the resources in the back of my book, and start to ask questions. I think one thing I haven't said, and I think is really important, a lot of people learn this history and they feel guilty. And what Indigenous people have told me is, I don't want your guilt. That's so unhelpful to me. I want, and I don't at this point feel guilty. I feel a sense of injustice. And I feel like my Jewish heritage tells me over and over and over again that my job is to step towards justice and repair. It's written into the fabric of our religion. And there's so much holding for how we can do that. And so I think we were intentionally not taught this history in school. So many of us never learned it. That's not your fault. I had an excellent education. No one ever taught me this history. I spent 23 years reporting in the American West, and I thought I knew a lot about Native nations, and I really didn't until I started working on this project. So this is all just to say we all have a lot of learning to do and a lot of action that we can take. And I hope that you join me in starting to think about this in a new way.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, Rebecca's book is called The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance. We will be sending out a follow-up email that will include a link to the program as well as a link to the book. Also remember to go to momentmag.com and register for Thursday's program about Lebanon and next week's program with Mandy Patinkin, Catherine Grody, and Gail Papp. Thank you guys all for coming.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.